All right. That's my cue. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We're honored to have State Senator Elizabeth Steiner with us. My name is Preston Mann. I am the Director of Political Affairs for Oregon Business and Industry. And Jay, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Jay Clark, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs for the Portland Metro Chamber here in downtown Portland, where I'm at right now. Thank you, Senator, for joining us, and welcome to all of our members.
My
Thanks,
pleasure.
Jay.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Jay, and thank you to the Portland Metro Chamber for co-hosting this event to us. I'm going to briefly introduce someone who many of you know, the senator herself, and then turn it over to her for some comments before we get into a Q&A discussion. Thank you to those of you that submitted questions in advance of today's meetings. Jay and I will moderate and curate those as we go along. Certainly, if you have any new questions that come along as we're discussing, feel free to use the chat function to input those. But without further ado, Senator Elizabeth Steiner is a physician, a mom of three, and for the past 6 years, she served as one of Oregon's chief budget writers. She's running for treasurer because she knows there's more to be done to help Oregonians save, boost Oregon's financial health, and invest in Oregonians' shared priorities: healthcare, housing, schools, secure retirement, and a strong state economy. With that, Senator, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks again for being here today.
Thank you so much, Preston and Jay. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us. I really appreciate it. Many of you have probably either met me or I can't see who's here, so I don't even know who's here, but many of you have probably met me. And if you're not, you've probably heard about me. I've been in the legislature 13 years. As Preston mentioned, my primary committee work has been budget, including 6 years as the Senate co-chair of the Joint Committee on Ways and Means. I've always done budget work because budget is policy. And you know this from your businesses. How you all choose to spend money in your business reflects your values, your decisions about what's best for your company. And the same is true in our personal lives. I've always believed that about our state as well. And I've tried hard to make investments and been cautious about making sure we're saving for Oregon's future as well over the time that I've been doing budget work. On the policy side, I've mostly focused on upstream public health. I'm running for treasurer for a whole host of reasons. First and foremost, the treasurer plays a critical role in helping many Oregonians achieve financial security, and that comes through a variety of ways, including ensuring that our pension system is as well funded as possible, because the more our pension system is funded, the less current public employers have to pay in to make up the unfunded liability. And when that happens, more money goes directly to program, which means there's more teachers in the school, more firefighters in the stations, more troopers on the road, more benefits available to the people who are really struggling to help them get back on their feet and be productive members of our community. Additionally, the treasurer's role is really important in building financial security for individual Oregonians and for families down the road, whether that's through the 529 or college savings plans, through Oregon Saves, the statewide retirement program for people whose employers don't offer a retirement plan, through the ABLE accounts for people with disabilities, or through a variety of other vehicles. The treasurer also works on financial literacy education to empower people to take control of their and their family's financial future. And that's really important because we know that financial security is the leading way to improve people's health. Financial insecurity, which causes housing instability, nutrition and food insecurity, problems getting enough sleep or enough exercise or spending time with your family, those all contribute to poor health. And when people are in poor health, they're not great employees, they're not productive members of our communities, and they and their children struggle, and these cycles repeat themselves. So the more we can help empower people to take control of their own financial future, to save even the small amounts that can make the big difference in their long-term well-being, the better off all of us will be down the road. So these are some of the reasons I'm really excited about. There's of course the role of the treasurer on the state land board, which is very important, along with the governor and the secretary of state, to manage our state lands for the maximum long-term benefit of Oregonians. And there are, of course, a whole host of very interesting questions about what that really means. So I'm excited about all of these opportunities and looking forward to working closely with the very skilled staff at Treasury and doing what I have always done, which is work closely with any stakeholder who wants to talk to me. I'm pretty well known in the Capitol for my open door policy. And I really value partnering with organizations like OBI, with labor unions, with parent-teacher associations, with advocacy groups, because I think when we bring as many voices as possible to the table, we get the best solutions to help make Oregon a strong, prosperous, healthy state. So those are all the reasons that I'm doing this. I'm super excited about the job, as you can probably tell. I could keep talking at you for a while, but I'd much rather take your questions. So I'll stop there and let Preston and Jay ask me some of your questions.
That's a fantastic segue. Thank you, Senator. And just as a reminder for those that joined us late, we do have a number of questions that were submitted in advance of today's meeting. Jay and I will alternate through some of those, but if you've got a burning question that comes up through our discussion, feel free to use the chat function and we'll get to it if we can. I'll kick us off with the first question. It's something, Senator, you and I were talking about before the webinar started, which is, what can Oregon State Treasurer do to foster a more favorable business climate and to attract more economic development and family wage jobs?
That's such an important question. And I think there are several things that the treasurer can do. The first is that, as most of you know, the treasurer is responsible for issuing bonding. And bonding in this state pays for an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of construction work in particular, which creates family wage jobs. And when people have family wage jobs in construction, they are able to spend that income on housing, on food, on discretionary things, which in turn creates indirect and induced jobs, which is very important for our economy. You all have, thank goodness, taken a lead role in opposing Measure 118. I was one of the first legislators on record that opposing it as soon as we knew it was qualifying for the ballot. And what I've told people is that passes and we lose businesses and it affects every other business in the state. So we understand that when one industry thrives, especially something as necessary as construction, for example, that every other business benefits. The second thing is, and I would say as an aside, I'm not going to trash my opponents much, but I want to be really clear about one thing that Senator Boquist said, and he said it in an OBI forum, candidate forum, so I feel comfortable repeating it here. Senator Boquist said that he only wanted to issue bonds through Oregon banks, and he only wanted to sell them into the state. We sell $1.5 billion of bonds a year on average. There is no bank in Oregon that is an Oregon-based bank that is capitalized at a level that will allow us to sell that much bonding year after year after year. And we do not have a market for $1.5 billion, excuse me, worth of bonds just within the state. He also says in his voters pamphlet that he doesn't want to do business with New York banks and he thinks we have too much debt as a state. We do not. I want to be really clear about that. And that fact is reflected in our excellent bond rating. If we don't sell bonds, that $1.5 billion doesn't come into our economy. And that is a non-trivial sum of money in my world. So I just want to be clear that the treasurer's role as the person who sells bonds is really important. The other piece of that that's really important is that a lot of that construction money, especially over the past several biennia, has gone toward low to moderate income housing. And workforce housing is critical to the well-being of all Oregonians, and it's critical to our businesses. I would guess that many of you have had the experience of trying to hire someone from out of state or from another part of the state and have them say, I can't take that job because I won't be able to afford housing or find housing. That's not acceptable in my book. So the treasurer's role in selling bonds and working closely with the legislature in the Debt Policy Advisory Committee is critical to ensuring that we have the infrastructure where employees in our workforce can live and thrive in our communities and be good employees for your businesses. The second place that the treasurer plays an important role in this is through the Oregon Growth Board and the Oregon Investment Council pieces that come into focusing on building Oregon businesses. That's really important because we have some extraordinary opportunities in this state with creative, thoughtful people who are very entrepreneurial, which is one of the things I love about Oregon, and are really pushing hard to grow businesses here in the state And we can and should be investing in those as a state through our pension fund. And that's something that I'm not at the moment convinced we're doing enough of. And it's something I'm going to be looking at really hard as the next state treasurer to ensure that on the one hand, I'm meeting the fiduciary responsibility to protect our pension fund and not take unreasonable risk. But on the other hand, if we can safely invest more into our state, into businesses developing in our state, that's good for all of us. So that's another place. Last but not least, there are economic development opportunities with state lands. Most of you know that a lot of state lands are leased out for grazing for our ranchers, and that's really important for parts of our important parts of our economy. We do timber leases on state forest lands, and those are really important. And we also offer rights to various things along our rivers, which the state also owns. So these are important ways that we can use state lands for economic development. Again, those may not directly touch your particular business, but they do create jobs and they do create economic activity in the state, which in turn benefits all of us one way or another. I hope that starts to answer the question.
That was great. Thank you. Jay, I think you have our next question.
Yeah, as treasurer, are there specific regulations or any particular bureaucratic hurdles that you believe need reform to better support the business community and small business owners?
You know, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. What I would say is this. I have not heard about anything that's within the treasurer's bailiwick for that yet. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but it does mean I haven't heard about them on the campaign trail. If they exist, I want to hear about them. I'll go back to my point about an open door. If I don't know a problem exists, I can't work to fix it. I'll give you a pretty good example. We've been trying to get a veterans home in Roseburg for a really long time, and there's been an ask for the state to make an investment. I'm not going to go into the really nitty-gritty details, but the long and the short of it is we were missing a critical piece of information about how we could move this on the federal level. And once I learned that critical piece of information, I know enough about how the state works, about how money flows in the state, that I could figure out a way to do it that didn't put the state at risk, but did increase our standing on the priority list for the federal VA to draw down their matching funds. My point is, I've been doing this a while. If I hear about a problem, if I don't know how to solve it by myself, I know how to talk to a lot of other people who can help solve it. So what I can commit to is if there are things that the treasurer can do to create a better business climate in the state, I'm eager to hear about them. And I promise to work closely with you to do everything I can to mitigate those problems and to improve the climate.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Senator. I've got the next one for you. What are some specific goals or outcomes you hope to achieve during your tenure as state treasurer?
So there are some pretty specific ones and there's some more general ones. Obviously, increasing the funded status of the Oregon Public Employee Retirement Fund, our state pension fund, is critically important. As I mentioned when I did my opening remarks, the better funded our pension system is, the more money is freed up in current employer budgets for all the services that we all need and use and that benefit our community every day. It's kind of ridiculous for employers to be paying 10, 12, 14, 25% of payroll into PERS just to pay down the unfunded liability, because that money should be going toward actual delivery of services. So that's obviously a critically important goal. And it's going to be hard because investing a very large fund, and Oregon's pension fund is the 12th largest in the nation because we put all public employees in one fund. It is not easy to grow a fund that size because you have to have a very diversified portfolio. You have to work with really great internal and external managers. But I'm committed to doing everything I can to ensure the best funded status for our pension fund. The second thing that's really important to me are 529 plans. Now, these are referred to as college savings plans. What most people aren't aware of is that a 529 plan, money in a 529 plan, can be used for almost any kind of post-high school education. It can be used, for example, if you're living in Gresham and you want to go to PCC Rock Creek, which is all the way out on the eastern edge of Washington County, where there's a diesel mechanic program, you can use that money to pay for your commuting expenses or living expenses if you move over there. You can use it to buy your tools that you need for the program. You can use it to pay for your tuition. Diesel mechanics make decent money, and those are good jobs, and we need diesel mechanics in the state. So we need to make sure that people understand that 529 plans are available, because right now, only about 1 in 8 kids in Oregon has a 529 plan. So we need to be doing a much better job of educating people so that they start saving, in part because we know that having even $50 to $100 in a 529 plan makes it 300% more likely that a kid will go to college and 700% more likely they'll get some form of post-secondary education. Those are non-trivial numbers, right? And if we can do that, if we can prove the educational status of Oregon's young people, that changes our trajectory as a state, because education is the best path to financial security through a great job. The third thing is that I want to push people to save more money, because having that buffer, that $500, $1,000 in the bank that so many people don't have, can make all the difference in the world in the event of a blown tire. Because a blown tire means you actually have to replace all 4 of your tires in this day and age. If you don't have that money, then you can't get to work. If you can't get to work, you don't get paid. You don't get paid, you lose your housing. And if your kid has to move in the middle of the school year, even once, between kindergarten and 12th grade, they are 20% less likely to graduate high school on time, right? So all for the want of the money to pay to replace your tires, which is not cheap, but it's not crazy expensive. So we need to help empower Oregonians so that more Oregonians are banked, whether that's through our credit unions or our banks, because many people are not. We need to make sure that they know how to save effectively, and the power of saving even $1 a day to change the trajectory of their family's life. We need to make sure that they understand what Einstein called the most powerful force in the universe, which is compound interest. And most people were never taught about that. So working with partner organizations, whether that's with your businesses to offer free financial education to your employees, or with the unions, or with parent-teacher associations or communities of faith, anybody who wants to partner with us, I want to do everything we can to empower people through financial literacy education and help them build the savings that can transform their family's future. So, and the last thing I want to say about that is this. There are some states and some local jurisdictions who've established what some people call baby bonds or child savings accounts. These are savings accounts that are set up for children when they're born in the state, and they're often funded with philanthropic dollars. I'm already in conversation with several large philanthropic organizations about the potential for funding, providing some funding. And if you create a savings account for a child when they're born and seed it with even a little bit of money through that fabulous power of compound interest and through the ability of families to put in even a little bit of money over time, that can turn into a substantial chunk of money that's available for a child when they turn 18. And that allows them to further their education, to maybe buy a car, to start saving for their own home, all the things that we know make a difference in the state. So I am very optimistic that we can get the first stages of a child savings account set up within my first term in office.
Great. Our next question is, what are some areas of the state treasurer's office that you think are currently performing well, and what would you like to see improved?
Well, I think I've started to answer some of those questions. I think we've done a good job of setting up and managing the 529 accounts. I think we've done a good, Treasurer Reed's done a great job of setting up the Financial Literacy Council. I want to build on all of those efforts. So I wouldn't say that those are not good. I would say that they can be even better. And I want to build on those efforts to make sure that more kids have the financial security they need, the educational funds that they need to get their education. I think we need to revamp I think we need to continue to improve, more accurately, transparency. There's a lot of questions about how we're investing our funds. And on the one hand, there are certainly limitations, especially when we invest in private equity, where we've got non-disclosure agreements that we have to abide by. But there are ways that we can be more transparent. And I'm looking to talk to some focus groups of engaged people to talk about what would make our websites more user-friendly, what would make it easier, and how do we make it clear where our parameters are and why we can't disclose certain information? Because I think when people understand why you can't do something, they don't get as grumpy with you for not doing it. I'm a big fan of explaining stuff to people and communicating really clearly. I think we're going to have some questions about how we manage our investment portfolio. There's a lot of push. Treasurer Reed worked with outside consultants to develop the net zero plan, which would work to cut the carbon footprint of our portfolio by 50% in the next 10 years, and then get it to net zero in the next 25 years. I think that's an admirable goal because we have to take into consideration the risks to businesses. We see this right now, OHSU is postponing a bunch of elective surgery because there's a huge national shortage of IV fluids because a factory was badly damaged by Hurricane Helene. That's a climate associated risk. And we have to, as part of our fiduciary responsibility as investors, we have to understand all of those associated risks. We also need to have funds to invest in green technology and move those forward. We're not going to immediately divest from fossil fuels. That's, first of all, impossible, and second of all, not fiduciarily sound. And obviously, that's critically important. We're not going to immediately say we won't invest in private equity with new investments here. We're going to take a very measured approach to this, but we do need to demonstrate that we can do this because we know that at some point in the foreseeable future, these stocks are not going to be profitable. And ultimately, we have to invest in stocks that are likely to be profitable. So we'll be looking at that, and that's going to take a lot of transition and change management within the agency. But those conversations have started already under Treasurer Reed's leadership, and I'm looking forward to continuing them and trying to move them forward in ways that balance what appear on the surface to be competing interests, but I don't think ultimately are.
Thanks, Senator. A somewhat related question. Do you plan to push for specific legislation in 2025? And if so, what?
Yeah, I'm looking at a couple of things. The first is a bill that I'm already in conversations with the labor unions about, the trade unions in particular, to make financial literacy education a mandatory part of registered apprenticeships. Now, whether I'm talking with the labor commissioner about this, whether it's all apprenticeships or just a pilot program with some of them, I don't know that, but at least we're starting in this place because we have an opportunity then, and we know people are going to have great jobs because our skilled trades are really good family wage jobs. We know that oftentimes what happens is they get those first really good paychecks as apprentices, and they say, cool, I need a really big new truck. Well, they probably need a truck. I could make a pretty compelling argument that they would do just fine with a smaller used truck for starters, and then figure out what the delta would be between what they're paying for that used truck on a monthly basis and what they would be paying for the new truck, and save that money. And all of a sudden, in a fairly short period of time, you've got the down payment for a house, right? So we need to take advantage of the fact that these are young people who are about to launch into very good careers in the skilled trades, make very good money, and we want to help empower them to make great decisions financially. So that's one of the things I'm working on. I'm actually working on a bill to partner with businesses and figure out if there's a way we can do some kind of a tax credit or build savings plans for people who do financial literacy programs through their employers. So I'll be looking forward to more conversations with OBI about that. And I'm going to have to check my notes for what my third one is because I've forgotten one, but I will check right this second. As you can imagine, I have a lot on my brain right now.
It's a busy time of year.
Yeah. Oh, and then the third one is, thank you. Some of you may know that I passed a bill in 2024 to create the Monsanto Settlement Trust Fund, which was money that came into the state through a big settlement with Monsanto for PCB cleanup. And Oregon has this law that says that you can't invest public funds, period. And the only reason we can invest the pension fund is that it's not actually the state's money, it's the retirees' money or future retirees' money. And that's why we're allowed to invest it. I want to pass a bill that says that if money comes into the state outside of the traditional revenue streams, and it's dedicated to a specific purpose, that it can then be invested. Because it would be great if that settlement fund could be invested and we would have funds in perpetuity for cleanup of these forever chemicals. The cultural trust is another good example. The money in that fund comes entirely from philanthropic donations and the extra fees that people pay on the cultural trust license plates. Those are not general fund. Those are not lottery funds. Those are not considered part of our regular revenue streams. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to invest those funds and improve the long-term funded status for the cultural trust, and thus build the economic activity that the arts and culture impart on our communities across the state. So that's my third one.
Great. Thank you again for that. Our next question is, what do you think is one thing about the state treasurer's role that goes largely underappreciated or unrecognized? We've touched on this a little, but let you expand.
Most of it. I would bet you dollars to donuts that the vast majority of Oregonians don't even know we have a state treasurer. And if they know, they don't know who the state treasurer is, and they don't know what the state treasurer does. Many people think the state treasurer runs the budget, and that's not true. That's what I've been doing for 6 years now. And obviously the chief financial officer in DAS does that as well. But I think that people really need to understand that the treasurer plays a whole bunch of critical roles in our state that have impact on the day-to-day lives of everyone. Even if you yourself are not a beneficiary of PERS, maybe you have a family member is, or maybe you have a kid in the public school system, and there could be more teachers there if we were doing even a better job with the funded status of our pension system. Maybe you don't have a kid who needs a 529, but maybe you have a grandchild does. Or maybe your future physician is someone who is right now being born and would be more likely to go to college and get that medical education if they had a 529 plan. So I think people need to understand that even if you yourself are not touched by these programs or the work the treasurer does, what the treasurer does is really important to the long-term well-being of virtually everyone in the state, and certainly our state as a whole. So those are some of the things. I mean, there's obviously all the stuff about the treasurer being the banker for the state. That's kind of inside baseball and government operations stuff, but it's pretty important too. And there may be ways, for example, that we could work to reduce credit card fees, which would in turn reduce costs for people who are getting a new driver's license if they want to pay with a credit card. All of those are things we can think about as the state treasurer.
Well, I agree with you that not many people know what our treasurer actually does, but one of the topics that the treasurer deals with that most people have a very strong opinion about is the PERS fund.
Yes.
So how would you rate the current condition of the PERS fund, and what does your general plan look like for managing this going forward? And I know this is a huge topic, so forgive the simplicity.
It's a huge topic. I'll start, and I think I've touched on this a little bit, but look, I would love to see our pension system funded up into the low to middle 90s, right? Percent of unfunded actuarial liability. Right now we're in the high 80s. That's not good enough from my perspective. And yet, partly that's because we have made a lot of investments in things that are going to take a while to see the returns. Private equity, real estate investment trusts, things like that don't offer returns in the same way that public equities do, or fixed income does. So we have to think really carefully about how we understand our funded status. I think we do need to make sure that our portfolio stays balanced so that we're buffered against downside risk in different sectors of the investment world. And we need to make sure that we're not overweighted in one particular area. And those are all things I'm going to be looking at. I touched on some of this when I talked about the net zero plan. Right now, quite appropriately, we have a variety of investments in both fossil fuel extraction, but also related industries like pipelines and refineries and things like that. Those are good investments right now. There will come a time when those will not be. And so it's going to be important to work with our professionals to determine when's the right time to sell those. On the one hand, we don't want to miss out on profit from them, but on the other hand, we want to sell them when people still want to buy them. If we wait till they're not getting any profit, then nobody's going to want to buy them from us. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation. And as I said, we will try to be as transparent as possible, but we also can't show our hand completely because then we lose some of our competitive advantage in the market, and we have to think about that. So do I know the details of every single thing I do differently? No. I have deliberately chosen not to engage in those conversations directly with members of the investment council or with our chief investment officer, Rex Kim, yet, because I don't think it was appropriate for me as a candidate. But I attend OIC meetings when I can. I've been a little busy on the campaign trail lately, but I attend them when I can. And I'm following them, and I look forward to digging in really deep starting on, I wanted to say November 6th, but realistically, I might take a day to recoup after the election, all being well, but soon. And I'm already starting to build a team, understanding that there's no guarantees, but trying to build a team so that we're ready to hit the ground running after the election and ensure that we don't spend the first 6 months just figuring out where the literal and figurative bathrooms are. So I hope that's a good starting place, Jay.
Thanks, Senator. I've got the next one for you. Oregon has faced challenges in funding infrastructure projects. What is the Treasurer's role in ensuring critical infrastructure investments are made while maintaining financial stability? And more specifically, as the legislature prepares to consider a transportation package in 2025, how does the Treasurer's office engage in that process?
So it's a funny situation because on the one hand, the treasurer is integral to that process in the sense that, as I said earlier, the treasurer is responsible for selling bonds, and virtually all infrastructure in the state is major infrastructure like bridges and road revisions. Our major road revisions are funded through bonding, but the treasurer doesn't actually make those allocations. What the treasurer does do is work with the Debt Policy Advisory Commission to determine what our debt capacity is while still ensuring that we're not paying too much of our general fund as debt service. We tend to try to keep our debt service below 5% of the general fund, which I think is a very prudent target. So we need to be thinking about those questions, and the treasurer does play a critical role in that. The treasurer plays a role in going to New York and talking with the banks and working with them on bond issuance to help us get the best possible rates for those bonds. And the better rates we get, the more capacity we have, right? Because if we're trying to keep our debt service below 5% and we get lower rates, that means that we have savings over our anticipated debt service, and we can issue more bonds. So it's really important for the treasurer to stay closely engaged with determining our debt capacity. And sometimes the treasurer and the Debt Policy Advisory Commission have to get involved with studies. For example, I know tolling is something of sort of a four-letter word, but for some people, but if we were to consider tolling back bonds for the interstate bridge, for example, the Debt Policy Advisory Commission would work with outside consultants to do the analysis to ensure that we had a good business case to put forward to the banks that would be helping us issue those bonds. And that's another place the treasurer plays a role. So it's a lot of infrastructure work, if you'll forgive me for saying that, to create the bonding for infrastructure. But the legislature ultimately, and to some extent the governor, make the decisions about what passes and how things are going to be allocated, how bonding is going to be allocated. The treasurer is responsible for selling the bonds and continuing to advise the legislature and the governor about what our capacity is.
Thank you for that. Our next question actually came from a text, and financial literacy has been deprioritized in our public education, according to many, but it's so critical to developing young people's future as leaders. So how do we turn that around? How do we bring that back into the early
Well, the
years?
good news is we did pass Senate Bill 3, in 2023, which requires financial literacy education for high school graduation. Now, that's primarily focused on high school, which is certainly a good way to do it. And we know that there are really good programs. Junior Achievement, for example, has great programs for elementary and middle school kids to start teaching financial literacy through things like virtual lemonade stands, right? We know that financial literacy education can be super engaging. The credit unions have some great programs where they go into a high school with a bunch of their members, their employees serving as volunteers. The students get an app on their phone that tells them, this is your job, this is how much income you earn a year, this is how many people are in your family. You have to go around to all these different booths and figure out about housing and transportation and food and utilities based on all the other decisions you make, and figure out your budget on a monthly basis and how much you're going to be able to save. Those kinds of interactive programs really engage kids and help them understand why this stuff matters to them now and in the future. So I'm very excited to continue to work closely. The treasurer actually has a seat ex officio on the State Board of Education. I plan to leverage that position to really help talk more about financial literacy education throughout the K-12 system. I really also want to engage more with our community colleges and our public universities around financial literacy education for college students. And I think there's an incredible opportunity there as well. So I'm all in for upstream. I'm a family physician by profession. And if there's one thing family physicians know, is that prevention is better than cure. And I would much rather focus upstream, helping empower young people to understand how to manage their finances than to have them struggling with debt and financial insecurity down the road. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Thank you, Senator. I've got another one that was submitted to me through the chat, so I'll read that to you here real quick. Rural Oregon is enormously impacted by state lands as a neighbor, as a partner for recreation, and sometimes for business. And by the way of that, we've seen several mill closures in rural Oregon. We've seen massive impacts from fires, and certainly you could speculate about more. How will you help rural communities as a member of the State Land Board specifically?
One of the things that I'm most proud of in this campaign is the number of endorsements I've received from rural Republican legislators, county commissioners, mayors. Just today, I picked up Representative Kim Wallen's endorsement down from Medford. And they've endorsed me because I spend a ton of time in rural Oregon. I actually counted, and between March of 23, when we started our Ways and Means community hearings, and the May 24 primary, I was in 24 of our 36 counties for work, right? Because it's important to get out there. It's not important to just say, come to me and talk to me. You have to get out there on the ground. Some of you probably also know that I did a ton of work in 2023, tried to get a bill through in 24 to help with wildfire funding. Again, that was mostly people from rural communities who were working with me on that, because they are the ones who are the most impacted. Ranchers, timber companies, they're the ones who are most affected by the costs for wildfire suppression. So I was working very closely with them. I am a firm believer in getting out there and talking with people. I'm a firm believer in the wisdom of crowds. So as a member of the land board, I think it will behoove me to continue to do what I've always done, which is go out and talk to people, understand what the impacts are of the state lands and what kinds of options there are for land board decisions. I was over in Bend a few weeks ago, and there are 3 situations over there where the Department of State Lands, which is essentially under the land board, is looking to swap lands or buy lands or sell lands, and they all have different implications. And you can't just look at them as a whole and say, oh, DSL is doing this, because you have to really understand the unique characteristics. And the only way I could do that was to actually talk to local people. I didn't actually have the chance to go out and see all these areas, but that's the kind of thing I would normally try to do, is get boots on the ground, figure out what's going on there, and figure out if there are ways that we can leverage opportunities against each other to maximize economic benefit and recreational opportunities now and into the future through our state lands.
Thanks, Senator. I've actually got the next one as well, and then I'll kick it over to Jay for one final question before we allow you to sort of close this out with any final thoughts.
Sure.
But my question is related to something you mentioned at the top, Measure 118. I just want to take an opportunity to thank you for so quickly joining the No Coalition and endorsing a public no vote, and for recognizing this measure as the urgent threat that it is. But I just wanted to give you a moment to expand upon your rationale for joining the
Sure.
coalition and for taking that public stance.
Absolutely. There are way too many businesses in Oregon that would meet the threshold of $25 million in gross revenues whose profit margins are below 3% annually. If we then turn around and take 3% off the top, many of those businesses will then be in the red instead of in the black. That is not a recipe for economic growth in our state. That is a recipe for businesses closing, for businesses leaving our state, for job loss, for economic depression, for decreased revenues for the state. It's also incredibly poorly constructed in terms of determining who is actually eligible for this, I don't even know what to call it, rebate, that is promised through the measure and would be left up to a complex method, which would be very costly to administer. It would also be incredibly costly to the state because of the hold harmless provisions, where if the amount of money a family was getting back would put them over federal thresholds for certain benefits, the state would then have to hold them harmless and continue to provide those benefits at no cost to the individual. And we would have to offset all the costs that the federal government had been paying. I can't even begin to tell you how much I can. I mean, I think the Legislative Revenue Office did an analysis, but we're talking about billions and billions of dollars annually to make up for those lost benefits. I am unbelievably ticked off that some out-of-state billionaire was able to come in and buy this onto our ballot. And if there's one thing I think we all need to learn about this, is that we need to revamp our initiative system. Do I think we should maintain an initiative system? Sure. The people need to have a voice. There are certain things we would never pass because the legislature wouldn't have the guts, unfortunately. And they're good things. But fundamentally, we have to make it harder to get something qualified for the ballot so that it can't just be a bunch of signatures from the Portland metro area that aren't representative of the vast majority of the state geographically. So I have been, you've described this, Preston, as an urgent threat. When I talk to people, I describe it as an existential threat to our state, because I think the damage that this would cause to our economy is almost incalculable and truly potentially devastating. And I am not prone to hyperbole.
Well said. Thank you.
Well, for our last question, we appreciate all the time that you've given us to talk details about policy and proposed policy. And this last question, just very generally, the election's in 11, 12 days, very scary, right around the corner. So if you had any closing thoughts about how your election's going, if there's any polling, if there's any asks you have of us or society in general, to make sure election day goes smoothly for everyone and victorious for you.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to say that. I'll talk briefly about my election, and then I'll talk just in general. Some of you may know that my Republican opponent is Brian Boquist. I mentioned my concerns about what he would do to our economy around bonding and his lack of understanding of the job. The problem that we have in this race, and frankly, if it was just Brian, who is not doing anything to actually run a race, he doesn't seem to really actually want the job. If it were just him, I wouldn't be too worried about my race. The problem is that the Working Families Party nominated its own candidate, and then the Pacific Green Party endorsed her. She's a retired professor of economics from Portland State, which makes her look pretty plausible to people. And we have a lot of young, non-affiliated, fairly progressive voters who hear Working Families Party, Green Party, and think, cool, those are my people. I'll vote for her. So since she got in the race, we have had 3 polls that show her steady at 8%. Now in Oregon, 8% is spoiler territory. And in our most recent poll, she was still at 8%. I was at 42 and Boquist was at 39 with 12% still undecided. Margin of error in the poll was 4%, which means that Boquist and I are within margin of error. Now, do I think that as people start to really evaluate and look at the voters pamphlet and look at websites and look at endorsements, some of that 8% will come back to me because she's mostly taking them from me? Yes. And do I think that do I think it's plausible that Boquist could win? Yeah, I actually do. And I think we have enough checks and balances available in the state that I actually would not describe that as existential a threat as 118 is, but I would describe it as a problem because there are a lot of things that he doesn't understand about the job. And there are a lot of positions that he says he would take that I think would not actually be in the long-term benefit of our economy, of our pension system, of Oregonians' financial security, that I think we have to be aware of this. TV rates are not quite as terrible as they were because you all have made the decision, I think, to not do quite as much TV since the polling I gather is looking better on 118. So that's good, but it's still very expensive to get the message out. And I am, for those of you who don't know me, a very fiscally conservative person. We have more than doubled the rainy day fund in my tenure as co-chair of Ways and Means because I think saving is a good thing. And I don't like spending money I don't have to spend. Before my third-party opponent got in the race, I had planned for a $450,000 fall media campaign. We're now looking in the order of $850,000, all told, which is a heck of a lot more. So I ask you two things. I know that you've all invested a lot in the anti-118 fight. If there's any chance you can direct a little bit to my campaign, that would be amazing. You can go online at elizabethfororegon.com or checks go to Friends of Elizabeth Steiner, P.O. Box 42307, Portland 97242. Yes, I've written that out a lot this year. Or give me a call and we can talk about it. And the other thing I ask is this: if you have a personal network of people who you're comfortable talking to about this race, the undervote for treasurer is really high because, as we talked about earlier, people don't know what the treasurer does. They don't really care, and they don't understand why it's important to them. We need people to understand that this job is actually important to them and that I am far and away the best qualified person for the position. So that's my race. In general, I think the one other thing we all have to do, you will see that I think on Sunday in the Oregonian, there's going to be a letter signed on to by many legislators, bipartisan, I hope, just asking everybody to keep calm about the election and to not propagate mis or disinformation, but to take a deep breath and assume good intent. And it's hard in this day and age to do all of those things. And so I'm just urging you to remind everybody you know that taking a deep breath and waiting before we make assumptions and not assuming the worst and trusting that our democracy works the way it's supposed to, regardless of the outcome, one way or another, whether you're happy with it or not. And I suspect there are people on this call who would be happy with a whole bunch of different outcomes, right? And that's good. Diversity is a good thing. So whatever it is, I just urge everybody to take a big deep breath and not assume the sky is falling, and urge everybody else you know to do the same. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's always great to have more connections with OBI.
Thank you, Senator. It's certainly an underappreciated office, the Office of State Treasurer, but one that's critically important, especially to the work that all of us are engaged in. So thank you for stepping up to run for the office. Thank you for taking some valuable time this close to the election to speak with our members. Thank you to Jay and the Portland Metro Chamber for co-hosting this for us. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. We really appreciate it.
Take care, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you,
Senator, and have a good day, everybody.
Bye.